I'll start. This is what Joanna Russ's work meant to me. I'm Lila Garrott. I'm moderating. I thought I'd start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we can go from there. Bear, do you want to start?
My name is Elizabeth Bear. I write science fiction and fantasy. My most recent novel is called Karen Memory. It's a Wild West steampunk adventure novel featuring heroic saloon girls versus disaster capitalists. And my forthcoming book with Sarah Lynette, also known as Catherine Addison, who is nominated for everything this year, is called An Apprentice to Elves, and that'll be out in October.
I'm Eileen Gunn, and I write short stories. My short story collection, Questionable Practices, is available at the Book Room, I hope, in Small Beer. And I was a student of Joanna's at Clarion in 1976, and she was a large influence on how I looked at fiction and how I go about writing.
I'm Gary Wolfe, and I've never met Joanna Russ at all, but the way to read fiction, her influence on the way I read fiction is something that happened quite apart from science fiction. But I'm one of the guests here, and in case you're wondering, everything Peter Straub wrote about me in the program book is true.
I'm Nicola Griffith. I never met Joanna. I've met lots of people who have met her, and my very early work, my early thinking about my early work was definitely in conversation with her work.
And as I said, I'm Lila Garrett, and I never had the luck of meeting Joanna, but as a young teenager growing up in the Midwest, libraries, stocking her work were incredibly important to me. So a couple of you have already started on the question that I was going to ask first, which is I wanted to ask people to describe how they encountered Joanna and or her work initially.
Well, I blame my mother, who actually happens to be in the audience. I had the good fortune to grow up in a house full of thousands of science fiction books, including much of the feminist oeuvre of the 1970s. And basically, I'm what happens when you give Joanna Russ to an 8-year-old. So, use this knowledge for good.
I think I encountered Joanna's work first in her reviews in F&SF, and I had read some of her books before I went to Clarion. And then at Clarion, she taught a week, and at the end, when we were all exhausted, and she was exhausted too because she was having severe back problems. She had off and on medical problems in the latter part of her life. So we were perfectly attuned to one another. Her feminist writing it's funny and striking, and it is perspective changing. And I read, aside from her critical reviews, which are also perspective changing, and I think that is where I mostly encountered that her fiction is something else again, but her critical writing is something that you're encountering a superior mind directly in her reviews.
I'm just going down. I have one anecdote. I began reading her F&SF reviews as well, and a lot of those have been collected in The Country You've Never Seen from Liverpool University Press. And some of them are amazingly prescient. Gene Wolfe's first novel was called Operation Aries, which even he detested. You don't mention this. But she saw something in it. She said, this guy is going to be important when nobody else was looking at it. But the thing that made me realize something about science fiction I hadn't realized before was just a simple coincidence. I didn't read The Female Man when it came out in 1975. A couple of years later, I got the paperback. But at the time I read it, there was a huge best-selling women's discussion group national sensation around a novel called The Women's Room by Marilyn French, which was a very powerful, very angry, and very despairing novel about fate of women in the world that they had to live in the 1950s to the 1970s. And it was very powerful, but it was completely grim and bitter, and it didn't sort of, it's not the sort of thing that makes you want to be a feminist. It's the sort of book that makes you want to be dead. But at the same time, I was reading The Female Man, which covers a lot of the same territory, with at least as much anger, but is about alternatives in a way. And there are alternatives in The Female Man that are as grim as The Women's Room. There are alternatives that are somewhat hopeful. And in reading these two things together and talking to some of my friends about it who were in these discussion groups, science fiction can show you more than one way, and mainstream fiction can only show you one way at a time. And that seemed to me to be a very great insight in the 70s.
I honestly don't remember how I encountered, or even when I encountered Joanna Russ. I suspect I encountered her shockwave more than her actual work. I think I encountered the people she had worked with and around. So I was reading Susie Charnas, Vonda McIntyre, all those writers. And I'm pretty sure that one of the first two things I read of hers was, it was either When It Changed or it was How to Suppress Women's Writing. And both of them made me think. When It Changed actually really pissed me off, and I can explain why later. But once I had found her, once I had found How to Suppress Women's Writing, I went and I read just about every book she wrote. I think I have all of those. I have not read her individual columns, but I have read just through that book. I think she was very, very smart, very, as Gary says, prescient, and incisive. She just cut through the crack. It was great.
Yeah, we had a panel on her criticism specifically yesterday, which was very interesting. That had David Hartwell on it, who of course also knew her well. And the amount that she was willing to say in reviews that other people were not necessarily going to say. It was mentioned that she was writing reviews for FNSF at the same time that Spider Robinson was writing reviews in the other, I believe it was Galaxy. And the contrast is supposed to be quite something. But I first read The Female Man as a teenager, looking through SF in my local library according to, I had the Clued SF encyclopedia. And The Female Man was the book that told me I wasn't crazy. There were other people out there who had similar opinions. And that stream of thought even existed in the society of my childhood was incredible. But one thing that people have been mentioning, intellectual responses to Russ's work, but her work also tends to arouse deep emotional responses. So I was going to ask people what the thing is of hers that emotionally involves you the most.
Well, I think Nicola started to say something about When It Changed.
Yeah, we want
That
to
I want to hear.
When It Changed pissed me off because I found the end. I would love to admit her. I would love to sit down by her beer and talk about this, because it struck me that the end of that novella was a failure of imagination, and I was gutted because it was brilliant, and How to Suppress Women. Everything else I've read of hers is brilliant. And that was just like, she got right up to the edge and just.
I think you're allowed to spoil it.
Okay.
So if you want to be specific.
Yeah.
All right, When It Changed, I'm assuming most people are roughly familiar with the novella. It's about a planet while away where only women have lived for a very long time. And women there are people. In that sense, Ammonite owns just about everything to that novella. And the ending of the story was this woman, Janet, who's an amazing, just great, capable person, meets men for the first time. And there's a quote in there about how she looked at this person and she felt like a second-class citizen. And I thought, why? It's been 800 years. Culturally, why? Where does that baggage come from? And it pissed me off. That single thing. It was just one paragraph and it fucked up everything.
I wonder if because that story has always seemed to be in dialogue with Tiptree's used to do your read, which does pretty much the opposite at the end. And I know the two of them were in correspondence with one another.
They were. That correspondence is excerpted in the Tiptree biography that came out recently.
Which is an excellent biography.
Oh,
For me, I think the story of hers that I have the strongest emotional response to is We Were About To, which I can't even talk about without tripping up. And I think it's the opposite. If there is that little flinch at the end of When It Changed. I have also written a novel that is in argument with When It Changed, which is Carnival. I have not written a novel that's in argument with We Were About To because it's not, I have nothing to argue with in that book. I mean, it's an incredibly despairing book, but there's an honesty to the despair. There's a lack of self-deception in her protagonist, who's like, this is what, and basically it's a sort of an apocalyptic novel in the small band of survivors, and her protagonist's point is, why are we doing this? We're just putting off the inevitable. And actually the only other story I can think of off the top of my head that is willing to be that bleak is a very short story by John Varley called The Manhattan Phone Book Abridged, which is just a list of names from the Manhattan Phone Book and how they die in the nuclear war. And it's not that, it's the exact opposite of the cozy catastrophe where we are the Swiss Family Robinson, you, me, and all the people we like survive and build a better society. And I had never encountered anything like that when I first read that book, and there's still not a lot out there that's just willing to I mean, you got the whole Sean Brunner, Arthur C. Clarke, humanity ends, but we evolve into something else thing. And God, I don't know what I'm this, but there's a sort of artistic courage in being that, like, I'll show you more dark. Bring it.
It just steps out there.
Yeah.
Absolutely unprotected. She just does it. It's great. I like it.
Yeah, unprotected is a great word. Just here it is.
Yeah.
And it's both a scathing intellectual rebuttal to the kind of book that a lot of us have read, and a novel in its own right. It's as well characterized as it needs to be. It could have been just the intellectual point, but it works even if you haven't read any of this large pile of castaway spaceship novels.
Yeah, which we all read.
Well, I want to know what kind of a teacher she was.
She was actually a fairly distance teacher. Because she was in pain, previous instructors had spent more time with us, and we were in better space to socialize. By the end of the workshop, we were all exhausted. We hadn't had any sleep in 5 weeks. She critiqued word by word each story. She helped me personally enormously understand things that I had been writing instinctively without understanding that there were actually words for what I was doing, and I wasn't always hitting it consistently. That's a point of view. I actually had never heard point of view. But because I was a reader, I was pretty consistent in point of view. And she marked one glitch in the story, and I asked her what it was. And of course she could explain like that. And immediately you understood what she was talking about. She was brilliant she knew more than anyone in the workshop. You know, she was, and there were a bunch of smart people in my workshop, but she could give the good writers perspective on their work. I'm not sure that she could help the people in our workshop who would never be writers. She couldn't help them be writers. And I'm not sure that the workshop is any help to people that deep in their hearts don't want to be writers. If you haven't already decided to be a writer and that it's worth the amount of pain that Clarion entails, if you haven't decided that, it's probably unwise to go. You don't go for a good time because you're not going to have a good time. And she did very political critiques of the stories that required political critiques. But some of them really were not worth the power that she could bring to them. So that's what she was like as a teacher. Afterwards, she taught in, I think she was at Binghamton at that time. She taught in Colorado at the University of Colorado, and then she came to Seattle where I live. So I got to know her far better after the workshop than during the workshop. But her critical writing was, for me, the point at which there was the dynamic way she looked at stories, that books that I had been reading, and turned them inside out was, for me, magical.
I think How to Suppress Women's Writing is one of those books that's having ripples even now, because you find people who discover it, and none of it is outdated. Although, when it first came out in that trade paperback, this is a true story, the Proxima Thomas in Chicago had it down in the how-to section with gardening books and cookbooks. Sure, I'll take this.
Well, they are very effective subjects.
Oh, yeah.
If that's your goal. And they also, the tactics are still being used outside of, against women. They're being used against people of color. You know, they're being used against people who are physically disabled in some way. These are very useful tactics in every, I mean, my favorite current one was, yes, he was elected president, but he wasn't born in the United States. It's a flawed logic, but it's strictly right. Yes, she's a woman, but.
I've seen various versions of she did it, but as literally a bingo board, where you can go through someone's analysis, disparaging analysis, and check off the number of these that it commits.
And one of the things that I think actually is really important about How to Suppress Women's Writing, what it has brought to the critical dialogue, is one of the ways that you suppress women's writing is, of course, the divide and conquer. You know, she did it, but she's the only one. And of course, you know, we're here at Readercon with an awful lot of women writers, but, and this happens to me, every single one of us gets treated as an exception. And what that book did was it gave, at least me as a woman, tools to say, no, that's not true. You know, we're not exceptional. Well, we're all exceptional. But we're not, you know, I'm not an exception. I'm not a woman writer, I'm a writer. I am also a woman. And I am a writer. The Wikipedia thing, did you guys hear about this? Where some of the Wikipedia editors were going through pulling all of the female writers out of American writers and putting them in a separate category, American women writers. And there was like a big Wikipedia edit war, and I don't even know how it came out. But I mean, this was 2 years ago. Because somehow that exceptionalism has to be enforced. And the tools in the book to push back against that are hugely important. And important in that one of the ways that society gets us to buy into that exceptionalism is by telling us, you know, oh, you have to be in the Smurfette. You can't succeed unless you're in the Smurfette. And that's also not true. You know, we can haul each other up.
It's a book that also lets you see that the exceptionalism is a tool being used against women writers.
Yeah. It seems like a promotion, but it's not.
But as we pointed out, it's also useful against any group of writers that you want to marginalize for any reason.
Not even writers, it's basically have to repress.
Exactly.
And the rhetorical techniques of oppression are usually not explained that clearly.
Right, it's the wit in which she explained things that once you read the description, you thought, yes, that, but you had not, both that she wrote about them in ways that were sarcastic and funny often, but they were things that were hurtful to the reader. You know, you could distance yourself from the insults by the wit in which she expressed it, and the wit gave you a tool to reinterpret the experiences that you were having and how people were coming at you. So you could remove the condescension because you had Joanna's wit underneath that, reminding you that yes, this was condescending, this was hurtful, and you don't need to pay attention to it.
And that was a constant across her criticism and her fiction. There's an image in her novel On Strike Against God, which is a naturalistic novel that has a lot of very speculative imagery, where this is a book about a female college professor who's probably based on Russ, but hard to say how much of a self-insert really, who's in a small town, basically coming to consciousness of herself as a person with agency in the world. And there's a moment where she's walking along the road and her Freudian psychoanalyst drops out of the sky like a giant vampire bat onto her head. And of course, this being a naturalistic novel, it's her awareness of her Freudian psychoanalyst, but this made so much sense to me of how Freudian psychoanalysis works as a concept to people. It's literally this vampiric thing in your consciousness.
You know, that's the only fiction of hers that really, really doesn't work for me, that novel. I need to reread it, obviously, see if other people like it. But I remember reading it and I was like, is this not edited? It lacked a particular kind of focus, and I would love to reread it and figure out why. Does anyone?
I've never read it.
Really, it just didn't work for me at all. It struck me that she was trying to be funny in some places, and I did not find it funny, which was very unsettling, given that it's Joanna Russ, because she was so sharp. Yeah, and so I tend to think maybe I just wasn't getting it. Maybe I was too young or something.
That one, that's actually my favorite Russ. And it perfectly reflected a kind of experience I had growing up, where it's a very black humor based entirely on laughing at the terrible things you've done to the inside of your own head. And if you haven't done similar things to the inside of your own head, I can see how it might not work. But that book comes from a very great place of trauma. It's got PTSD hovering all over it.
One of the things that I find really interesting, and various other people have mentioned this, is that we tend to talk about Russ very seriously, you know. But as you've both mentioned, she's funny and she's sharp, and she wrote like damn fine adventure stories, you know, which is nobody tends to get.
I did when Farrah Mendelssohn put together the collection of essays and asked me to do something. But the first thing I went for was the Adventures of Alex.
That's what
because
I was
she
just
knew
going
how
to
to she knew how to write sword and sorcery stories. She liked them. She and Fritz Leiber were pals. They put each other's characters in their stories, and I thought, this is just so cool, because Fritz Leiber is, if there's a patriarchal figure in science fiction, not that he behaved that way necessarily, but he just looked, you know, like a large bird, much larger than you are. And she, who I never met, but you know, she always struck me as being Alex being a version of herself. And that Alex, in turn, was kind of a version of the Gray Mouser. And so she knew science fiction inside and out. And through the Adventures of Alex stories and the novel Picnic on Paradise, she ticks off one thing after another. She knew Frederick Brown's fiction, she knew the conventions of astounding, she had read a lot of it, and this always came through in her reviews in FNSF as well. So yeah, she's always underestimated as just a good science fiction writer.
Yeah, and yeah, she's incredibly smart and tremendously important, and taught us all a lot about how the inside of science fiction works. Well, you know, we were too close to see it. But yeah, I mean, the Alex stuff it's swashbuckling, it's fabulous, it's fun. And I hate how that kind of gets, you know, it's, oh, this is great literature. You can't enjoy it, eat your vegetables. I like vegetables.
Well, also she tends to get, the emphasis tends to be on her feminism and on specifically analysis of gendered relations.
Yes.
And that's only part of what she does. When at Clarion, we were making up jokes, stories about jokes and a series of jokes from an alien point of view. And she just really got into that. We were all trying to remove humor from sort of the weight of making fun of other people.
But she did that little thing called Useful Phrases for the Tourist, which was, if you haven't read that, that was in Soberworks New Dimensions or something. And
I think there are versions of it online.
But there is a version online, I think, yeah, because, but just phrases that you need in visiting another planet, like that part of me is not edible. And they were just hilarious. It's 2 pages long or something.
Yeah, no, and there's a whole like little narrative in there as things become increasingly desperate for this morning.
I had to speak to the Earth Console. Every 4th or 5th line.
It also goes from I demand to speak to the Earth Council to I demand to speak to the Earth Council at once.
Sadly, apparently we lost Chip. I was privileged to see him interview Joanna at WisCon, WisCon 30, I think it was. And she was so delightful. It was mostly about Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah, she just discovered
she had just discovered how hot Spike is. We heard a great deal about James Marsters' abs. Feminist abs.
Well, I was around when she discovered slash fiction, and it was still sort of sub everybody's awareness. But I had known some slash writers in Eugene and had actually seen like paper dolls with sex appliances for KS sex and stuff. And so
I need the doll.
But Joanna had just discovered it, and she had, like, people had been saying, oh, really? Well, here's a fanzine. And she had taken them all home and read them very enthusiastically, and she was talking about them the way she was talking about Buffy, just like, this is fantastic, this is great. And then she wrote a couple of KS slash stories and read them at a small, bookstore in Seattle, and they were hilarious. They were the forbidden, Spock gives birth.
Where are those today? Are they in an archive somewhere?
They're available. I think they were published under another name in KS slash fancy.
Now there's
a really endearing one, just this really charming one where
I feel like maybe we
Kirk
need
and
to arrange
Spock are in bed and they're talking about their children. It's just really, really wonderful.
And this is making me wish the internet had been earlier. Because the paper fanzines, some of them have made it onto the internet, some have not.
But those actually, there is a project to put fanzines on the internet. The problem is mostly that some fanzines were intended to be extremely personal and not distributed, and they need to make sure they don't put those up because they're not asking permission, they're just putting them up. So those Joanna Russ stories may be up now on the internet if there's a slash section.
Probably is.
a woman of tremendous enthusiasms.
I can mention one other aspect of her influence that we haven't mentioned before, and that is not just a criticism of the reviews that she wrote in FNSF, but the actual academic essays that she wrote for magazines like Science Fiction Studies and Extrapolation, because she was very influential. One of her early essay, The Image of Women in Science Fiction. You can tell how early that is because everybody's used that title 100 times since then. But it began with a famous line, there are hundreds, there are myriad images of women in science fiction. There are hardly any women. Which was exactly right. But she also influenced a generation of academic critics such as ourselves. Other people have been writing in, well, there's a certain kind of academic prose which you see in literary journals that tries to look like what you see in sociology journals, which in turn tries to look like what you see in biology journals, which means it loses comprehensibility at some point along the way. And there's a generation of young scholars, and I like to think that I'm one of them, and I like to think that Brett Cox is one of them, who thought you can actually write scholarly essays using what we thought of as standard English, and you can make jokes in them, and they'll still get published. She did change the tone of science fiction studies for a while in the 70s. And it may not have had as much influence as it should have had, but it certainly to find something written in clear, witty, well-shaped sentences in the midst of MLA sentences was a huge relief to a lot of us.
And the interesting thing was that she did have credence in the critical establishment outside science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
She was well regarded by the MLA, by various academic institutions, even though she did not come up through academia at all initially.
Well, her criticism may not have been coming up through academia, but she herself is a graduate student at Yale.
Yeah,
She had a degree from Cornell. She studied with Nabokov. She had certainly the undergraduate and the graduate level chops to be considered. What she didn't do was go out and, as I recall, socialize a lot with academics. She was not an academic, but she had the academic chops to be respected.
She apparently went to Yale School of Drama, from what I've heard, and was going to write plays. And one thing I keep meaning to ask people who knew her is, does anyone know if she kept doing that at all?
Ask Chip.
Okay, I will.
Ask David Hartwell.
Yeah, David Hartwell didn't know. So, I'll ask Chip. But do people see Russ's influence around? I mean, we've talked some about how Russ has influenced us. Are we seeing it around in the rest of the field?
I can ask a question, Nicola, because, and I don't know if this is correct at all, but when I started reading Hild, I started thinking of souls. I started thinking of writing about a very little-known period of history reconstructed using essentially the devices of a fantasy writer. In the case of Souls, I think it was told from some generations later. And I don't know if there was an effect there at all, but there was, certainly she was writing historical fiction in somewhat of the same way you were.
I really like that novel. I like it a lot. I don't like it in that collection. My favorite is The Mystery of the Young Gentleman. I think that is just one of the best things she's ever written. I love it. But Souls is great. Souls is about an abbess in the 9th century, very early
12th century, I think.
I think it's earlier.
Maybe earlier.
Who a Viking ship comes and threatens rape and pillage, and it's about how this one woman makes them stop just through the power of conversation. Just the way Dylan would.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah, except it turns out that there's aliens.
There are aliens, yeah.
But we don't know that. And it's great. And there's one moment where big meaty Vikings threatening to rape nuns, and our hero says, "What's wrong with your hand?" Yeah, you've been on a boat for a long time, but seriously, what's wrong with your hand? It's like, nothing. And it's not perfect. I mean, she does not cure. She's not like a force field around her abbey, but things turn out a lot better because of this woman,
Mhm.
because of how she behaves, how she acts, how she reacts to this awful situation. And yeah, I think it might have had some influence on her. I certainly am very aware of it. I enjoyed it very much a long time ago when I first read it in the early 80s.
Yeah, it was, and I think the story, the young gentleman's story, actually alludes back to Souls at one point, where there's a line, something along the lines of the alien. The aliens left in the 12th century or something, so they've been gone forever. So it's clear that this is in a collection called Extraordinary People, and there are odd and subtle links between the stories in that collection, which I don't think I'd figured out. But yeah, I don't know. Do you feel influenced from her?
From that collection, that's my actual favorite of all her books. And I realized that I had subconsciously been linking Hill and Souls in a like its own subgenre that you were writing in that same subgenre that only you and Joanna were writing.
Yeah, we're definitely, I feel as though we're definitely in conversation, which is something we never corresponded.
And your interests, your worldviews are congruent in some way. Stylistically, not necessarily the same or anything, but they fit together.
I feel like Ursula Le Guin's Lavinia is in that conversation too, in some ways.
That's interesting.
Which would
Lavinia.
Ursula Le Guin's, her revisioning of the Aeneid from, but Lavinia is, if people haven't read this, is Aeneas's eventual wife, who is really not even a character in the original Aeneid.
And Le Guin in this book is doing this wonderfully layered, complicated meta-narrative thing. I mean, first of all, it's a lovely, interesting story about an interesting person who has an interesting life, and is one of those. And I read it after Hilt, and I was very much reminded of, like the two books fit together in my head in this lovely, complicated way. Especially in that modern narratives, reasserting the place of women in history, in complex roles with agency, from which they have largely been erased, not because they were not there, but because people very carefully excised them.
Because we're not part of the story that they want to tell.
Exactly.
And Lavinia complains about that.
Yes,
She's
a lot.
aware of the fact that she wasn't in the story.
Yeah. And she actually gets to talk to her chronicler, and have conversations with him. Yeah. And she's aware of herself both as a person and as a narrative construct. And there's some indication that she's aware not just of Virgil but also of Guin as her narrator.
And in a beautiful moment, Virgil is aware of Dante, and I've never gotten over it.
Yeah.
There's really a critical area there about the conversations that women writers of science fiction were having with one another, that's separate from the conversations they were having with men. But I'm sure that, I know that Joanna was at Milford. There were a good number of women at Milford. And I know that Joanna and Kate Wilhelm were at Milford together. And they had different viewpoints, but they're both very elegant writers, both people who take the words they put on paper very seriously. And I'd like to see an examination of what they were talking about in their fiction while they were both living in New York and addressing early, second generation feminism.
And there was definitely conversation also just at feminist SF generally. There was a panel earlier this con that was about the frozen tundra buddy track as a true feminist SF. And the Adventures of Alex, the Picnic on Paradise did not come up at that panel, but should have. So, again, basically the premise of that panel, for people who missed it, is that there are a lot of feminist SF novels that have people trekking on sledges through frozen tundra.
Trudging across the tundra mile after mile. Yeah. Well, it's a good place to it's a nice tense situation to put your characters in while they have long philosophical conversations. With themselves or others.
But she was definitely part of that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and the conversation was much livelier and more interactive in the early part of the 1970s and the late part of the 1960s. Then I think after that period, people were living separately. They were, had all scattered from the Milford books. They had all scattered across the country, and there was no internet. The ways of people having a conversation were more constrained.
Also, cyberpunk happened, and women were written out again.
Well, and that's not really the fault of the cyberpunks, because
I'm
they
not
tried to
blaming the
recruit me.
cyberpunks.
They tried to recruit me, okay? And they should defend but yes, cyberpunk was enormously popular with men and boys in a way that it did not necessarily capture women's imagination, because most of the books were written about men and boys.
There's also the rise of the mass market novel paperback as the primary form of SF as opposed to the fiction magazine, where the sort of emphasis in the field at some point switched from the magazine is the thing everyone reads to the novels are the things everyone reads.
That was more in the 50s, early 60s.
But it didn't fully finish switching until the late 80s from what I've seen. It was a long time. But that switch didn't have, like Russ has several collections, but as writers who work primarily in short form did start having more trouble.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the short form collections, which are much harder to come by now.
And the conversation does slow down and contract when it starts being dominated by novels. First of all, because they take longer to write and publish, and also because I can write, one novel in a given span of time in which I could probably write 12 short stories, which would be about different things. So I
think the other thing that slowed down the dialogue was not just a novel, but it's a series of novels, so that you have a discussion which is going on. Susie Charnis's Holdfast Chronicles appeared over like a 20-year period, and there's a very consistent argument going on among those four novels, but people who are reading them 15 years, having not seen the first two, the conversation just got lost in the clutter of time.
Speaking of time, I think it's about the point where I want to start asking fair questions. Does anyone have any questions? Evidently not.
No, I bet someone has.
No, they have comments. They have snarky things they want to say.
But I found, speaking to the enduring overall power of how to express and writing, I found this cover very useful at Pinterest on Twitter.
Could you, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you at all.
Speaking to the overall power of how to express and writing, I found just linking to the cover as an image macro to be a very useful rhetorical device on Twitter.
That cover design is incredible. Yes?
Can you say anything about Joanna Russ's impact on writers overseas?
Well, I'm from England, so in English terms, huge impact. I can't speak for Romania. I think also she had a very large impact in the women I've spoken to in Australia and New Zealand. But I can't speak to Russia, for example.
I know people like Lisa Krasnstein, Helen Merrick, and Rosalind certainly have talked about being influenced by her. In translation, I don't even know if her books are in translation.
She was definitely some have been translated into Japanese. I've seen a Japanese cover for the Alex collection. but I don't know about other languages, and I don't know about other books. Yes?
So I found Russ's criticism to be much easier to get into than fiction writing. I think it took me 3 tries to read the Wild Way books all the way through. And I know that this is something that's come up with Delany's writing as well. Like it's something that it sometimes takes effort to get into, and then once it clicks, it really works for people. Do you think that there's something in both of their works that make it maybe a little unfriendly at first, and then very friendly once you've made friends with the text?
Speak of the devil. I feel that, and this is also a thing I get with like Mike Ford, John M. Ford, and the thing that I have noticed about all of those people is that they're all very, very smart. And reading work by somebody who's much smarter than I am takes a lot of work until I just, you know.
And Russ was also intentionally writing experimental fiction in many ways. She was using postmodernist techniques. She was using things she swiped from James Joyce and Henry James and the other, and she was applying theory to her work. Whereas the criticism is often written for an audience who are a lay audience, an audience who aren't looking to read experimental fiction.
I think the big difference between her fiction and non-fiction is that her non-fiction is designed to help people in, and her fiction is designed to just say how it is. And it's like, come in or not.
Running catch up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd say the female man was accessible outside the field, and as with Dahlgren, you know, Dahlgren had a huge audience for a book that to science fiction readers was deeper and richer than the work they were used to. So the question is sort of whether the works of Joanna Russ and Chip Delany are more accessible to people outside the field, because we have within the field come with fixed ideas about what we're going to be reading. That would be my question.
Sneak up this one. Okay, keep it all here.
So, Chip Delany.
First, quick apology, and second, my memory of Joanna when she was writing the criticism is, by and large, she was pretty down on theory. She was one of the people who, I was somebody who very much liked theory. Half of what we argued about in letter after letter after letter was her feeling that anything that took on such a rococo rhetorical surface had to be 90% bullshit. She had that French thing of, if it isn't clear and clear and lucid, then, and I kept on saying, no, this stuff really is interesting. There's a lot of stuff. And she had an argument with her best student, a woman named Jane Gallup, who became a very good theorist. And when I first met Jane, I sort of said, I sort of was praising Joanna Russ, and she said, well, I don't think Joanna and I are speaking. And I said, oh, okay. Later on, Jane wrote a wonderful appreciation of Joanna, despite the fact that Joanna kind of turned against Jane for a while. And in a book called Anecdotal Theory, I think it's called, and she just talks about the first women's studies class she had with Joanna Russ and how important it was to her. And she has this wonderful, did you read from that already?
Nope.
No, we're out of time.
Oh, we're out. Okay, fine. I'll just leave it at that. Everybody else might know.
Yeah.
You were more succinct than all of us, Jay.
Yes.